In a quiet study in Switzerland, 1939, Carl Jung sat at his desk, deep in thought. Surrounded by books, his mind wrestled with a realization that challenged everything he had spent his life studying. As one of the greatest minds in psychology, he had devoted decades to understanding the human psyche. Yet now, an ancient Buddhist teaching stood before him, presenting a paradox that seemed impossible to ignore. After years of analyzing the depths of human consciousness, Jung encountered a 2,500-year-old Buddhist teaching that suggested the self he had spent his life defining might not exist at all. At first glance, Jung's concept of the integrated self and Buddhism's doctrine of no self, Anatta, appear to be complete opposites. One focuses on wholeness, while the other denies a permanent identity altogether. But is this contradiction real, or do these two perspectives secretly complement one another? In this video, we will explore the collision of these two profound worldviews, how Carl Jung and the Buddha, despite their vastly different approaches, arrived at insights that not only shape modern psychology, but also offer a transformative way to understand ourselves and our place in the world. Jung's encounter with Eastern philosophy. At the turn of the 19th century, a quiet revolution was taking place in Western intellectual thought. The rigid structures of European philosophy, long dominated by rationalism and Christian theology, were beginning to shift. Among the first to introduce Buddhist ideas into the Western world was the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, whose writings on suffering, impermanence, and detachment captivated a new generation of thinkers. Schopenhauer was among the first Western philosophers to openly admire Buddhism, declaring that its teachings on suffering and the illusion of self aligned with his own pessimistic view of human existence. His ideas would later influence Friedrich Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud, and most notably Carl Jung. Jung's exposure to Eastern philosophy deepened in the early 20th century, largely through his friendship with Richard Wilhelm, a renowned German sinologist and translator of Chinese and Buddhist texts. Wilhelm introduced Jung to the Taoist and Buddhist classics, particularly the I Ching and other foundational Eastern works. Their discussions expanded Jung's perspective beyond the confines of Western psychology, leading him to recognize striking parallels between Eastern philosophy and his own emerging theories of the psyche. From 1909 to 1914, Jung immersed himself in the study of Sanskrit and Eastern religious texts, dedicating several hours each morning to their exploration. His personal letters from this period reveal a growing fascination with Buddhist concepts, especially their parallels with the psychological patterns he observed in his patients. He saw deep connections between the Buddhist approach to suffering and the inner struggles of the Western mind, particularly the way Buddhism encouraged a detachment from rigid self-identification, something his patients often struggled with in therapy. Jung's fascination with Buddhist teachings. As Jung's interest in Eastern thought deepened, he began building one of the most comprehensive private collections of Buddhist texts in Europe. His library in Küsnacht, Switzerland, was filled with Sanskrit and Pali translations, Tibetan manuscripts, and Buddhist commentaries. He did not merely read these texts as an academic observer. He analyzed them through the lens of his psychological theories, searching for deeper connections between Buddhism and the workings of the unconscious mind. Through his clinical practice, Jung began to notice uncanny similarities between the experiences of his patients and Buddhist teachings on suffering, ego, and self-awareness. He observed that individuals undergoing deep psychological distress often encountered patterns of transformation that closely resembled Buddhist meditative insights. Many of his patients, without any prior exposure to Eastern spirituality, described visions and dreams that mirrored Buddhist symbols, such as mandalas, sacred circular diagrams representing wholeness and enlightenment. One of Jung's most profound realizations came when he recognized that Buddhism's teaching of no self, Anatta, directly challenged the Western concept of individual identity. At the core of Buddhist philosophy is the belief that the self is not a fixed, permanent entity, but rather a collection of ever-changing experiences and perceptions. This directly opposed the dominant Western psychological model, which viewed the self as an integrated, stable center of personality. For Jung, this was a moment of intellectual and spiritual crisis. His own psychological framework was built on the idea that individuals must integrate all aspects of their personality, both conscious and unconscious, to achieve a state of wholeness. a process he called individuation. But Buddhism suggested something radically different, that true liberation comes not from integrating the self, but from realizing that the self never existed in the first place. The turning point, a challenge to the concept of the self. This paradox fascinated Jung. Could it be that both perspectives, Buddhist no-self and Western individuation, were pointing to the same truth but from different angles? Rather than rejecting Buddhist philosophy, Jung sought to reconcile these two seemingly opposite views. He reasoned that while Buddhism taught that the self is an illusion, it did not mean that people should ignore their psychological development. Instead, he saw the Buddhist path as a form of psychological maturation, one that aligned closely with his concept of individuation. Jung's own experiences reinforced this understanding. During his personal descent into the unconscious, documented in the Red Book, he underwent intense psychological transformations that mirrored traditional Buddhist insights. He described experiencing a dissolution of ego, moments where his sense of identity collapsed, leaving him face to face with what he called the pleroma, a state of being beyond personal identity, filled with infinite potential. This closely resembled the Buddhist concept of sunyata, emptiness, where one sees through the illusion of the self and experiences reality without attachment. By the 1920s, Jung began incorporating Buddhist ideas into his psychological framework, albeit with caution. He acknowledged that the Buddhist approach to the self was profoundly different from Western psychology, but he also believed that Western minds might struggle with the concept of no-self without first going through the individuation process. He proposed that before a person could let go of the self, they must first fully develop it, a perspective that blended the Eastern and Western approaches. This synthesis of ideas marked a turning point in Jung's work. He no longer saw Buddhism as merely a foreign philosophy, but as a profound psychological system that offered deep insights into human suffering, identity, and transformation. His late writings, particularly those in psychology and alchemy and Ion, reveal an increasing appreciation for Buddhist teachings, as he explored how both Eastern and Western traditions offered complementary paths towards psychological wholeness. Conclusion: the meeting of two worlds. Jung's encounter with Buddhist philosophy did not lead him to abandon his concept of the self, but it did push him to rethink its role in human consciousness. While Buddhism teaches that true peace comes from transcending attachment to self, Jung maintained that individuals must first navigate the complexities of their unconscious before reaching such a state. This meeting of East and West, of individuation and no-self, would go on to shape modern psychology, spiritual practices, and the therapeutic approaches we use today. By bridging these two perspectives, Jung opened the door for a new way of understanding the self, not as something to be grasped or defended, but as a fluid, evolving process that ultimately leads to liberation. The Buddha's discovery of no-self. More than 2,500 years ago, in the stillness of a Bodhi tree's shade, Siddhartha Gautama sat in deep meditation, determined to find the root of human suffering. He had spent years seeking answers, practicing extreme asceticism, and exploring every spiritual path available to him. Yet none had led to the profound peace he sought. On that fateful night, as he entered a state of unwavering concentration, a realization unfolded, one that would challenge the very foundation of how people understood themselves. At that moment of enlightenment, Siddhartha Gautama saw through the illusion of self. He realized that what we call the self is not a fixed, permanent entity, but rather a dynamic, ever-changing process. It is an illusion created by the mind and attachment to a false sense of identity that gives rise to suffering. This was a radical departure from the beliefs held by the spiritual traditions of his time, which taught that every being possessed an eternal, unchanging soul, Atman. The Buddha's insight, however, revealed that clinging to such an idea was the very cause of suffering. In the days that followed his enlightenment, the Buddha shared this realization with his first disciples. In the Anatta Sutta, he explained that attachment to the self is the root of suffering. He urged his followers to examine their own experience and see for themselves that everything they took to be self was, in fact, impermanent and subject to change. Breaking down the self, the 5 aggregates, skandhas. To illustrate the nature of no-self, the Buddha introduced a powerful framework, the 5 aggregates, skandhas. He taught that what we perceive as the self is merely a collection of 5 constantly changing components. Form, rupa, the physical body and material world. Feeling Vedana sensations, pleasure, pain, or neutrality that arise from experience. Perception, Sana, the process of labeling and interpreting experiences. Mental formations, Sakra, thoughts, emotions, and conditioned responses. Consciousness, via awareness, the ability to experience but not a fixed entity. Each of these elements is constantly in flux. The body ages, feelings shift, perceptions change, thoughts arise and disappear, and consciousness itself fluctuates. Yet, despite this, we cling to the illusion that there is a single, unchanging I behind these experiences. The chariot analogy, understanding no self. To further illustrate his teaching, the Buddha used a simple but profound analogy, the chariot. Imagine a chariot with its wheels, axle, frame, and reins. When all these parts are assembled, we call it a chariot. But if we dismantle it piece by piece, where's the chariotness? It does not exist independently, it is merely a convenient label for a collection of parts working together. The same is true of the self. When we look deeply, we see that what we call I is nothing more than a label applied to an ever-changing process. There is no single, permanent essence that can be found when we break down the components of human experience. This realization is not just philosophical, it is profoundly practical. By recognizing that there is no fixed self, we begin to loosen our attachment to identity, pride, and the endless cycle of craving and aversion. We stop suffering over things we cannot control because we understand that change is the very nature of existence. The core teaching of Buddhism, letting go of the illusion of self. At the heart of Buddhism is the idea that freedom from suffering comes from letting go of attachment to self. This does not mean that we deny our existence or our experiences, but rather that we stop clinging to a rigid sense of identity. When we no longer see ourselves as separate, independent beings, we naturally let go of fear, greed, and ego-driven suffering. This teaching directly contrasts with Western philosophy and psychology, which often emphasize the development and strengthening of individual identity. In the Western tradition, the idea of a permanent soul or personal essence has been deeply ingrained for centuries. The concept of individuation, as seen in Carl Jung's work, centers around integrating all aspects of the psyche to form a cohesive self. Yet, from a Buddhist perspective, true peace does not come from integrating the self, but from transcending the need for a self altogether. How no self leads to liberation. To fully grasp the Buddha's teaching, one must not just intellectually understand it but experience it directly. Through meditation and self-inquiry, practitioners begin to see that their thoughts, emotions, and even their sense of self arise and pass away naturally. They realize that there is no fixed I behind these experiences, only an ongoing stream of phenomena. This insight has profound effects. We become less reactive when we do not see ourselves as separate. We are less affected by praise or criticism. We cultivate compassion, realizing that everyone shares this ever-changing nature leads to greater understanding and kindness. We release suffering. Clinging to self creates fear of loss, but when we see through this illusion, we experience a deep sense of freedom. The Buddha's teaching of no self, Anatta, is not meant to be a mere intellectual concept, but a transformative realization. It is a path to liberation, a way to free ourselves from suffering by seeing reality as it truly is. At first, this teaching can be unsettling. We are so used to identifying with our names, personalities, and histories that the idea of no self feels almost frightening. But as the Buddha taught, letting go of this illusion does not leave us empty, it leaves us free. Jung's concept of the self. Carl Jung's exploration of the self was one of the most profound contributions to modern psychology. Unlike traditional Western views that equated the self with personal identity or ego, Jung saw the self as something far more expansive. In his groundbreaking work Ion, 1951, he described the self as not only the center but also the whole circumference of the psyche. This meant that the self was not just the conscious part of our identity, but a totality that encompassed both the known and the unknown aspects of the mind. Jung distinguished between the ego and the self. The ego, in his framework, was the conscious I, the part of us that navigates daily life, makes decisions, and forms a personal identity. The self, however, was something much deeper. It integrated both the conscious and unconscious aspects of the psyche, acting as a unifying force that guided a person toward psychological wholeness. The process of individuation, the path to wholeness. Jung's research into psychoanalysis and dream interpretation led him to a key insight: those who embraced their unconscious aspects rather than suppressing them were the ones who achieved a state of psychological well-being and balance. This journey toward wholeness, which he called individuation, was the central goal of human psychological development. Individuation involved integrating hidden, suppressed, and often uncomfortable parts of oneself, including The shadow, the repressed, darker side of our personality, containing aspects of ourselves we deny or reject. Anima/animus, the inner feminine anima in men and the inner masculine animus in women, representing the unconscious aspects of our gender identity. The persona, the social mask we wear to conform to societal expectations. Through deep psychological work, Jung's patients often dreamed of symbols that reflected their inner transformation. One of the most striking and universal symbols was the mandala, a circular design representing wholeness, balance, and the union of opposites. The significance of the mandala in Jungian psychology. Mandala imagery, common in Hindu and Buddhist traditions, fascinated Jung because it appeared spontaneously in his patients' dreams and artwork, even among those with no prior exposure to Eastern philosophy. He interpreted the mandala as a representation of the self, a sacred symbol reflecting the individual's journey towards psychological integration. One of Jung's most famous case studies involved a businessman who repeatedly dreamed of a luminous crystal at the bottom of a deep well. Jung noted that this imagery closely resembled descriptions of the diamond body in Buddhist texts, a symbol of the enlightened self. Without any knowledge of Buddhist teachings, the patient had tapped into a universal archetype that had existed across cultures and time periods. Jung saw this as evidence of the collective unconscious, a shared psychological blueprint present in all humans, containing universal symbols, archetypes that emerge in dreams, myths, and religious traditions worldwide. Jung's self versus Buddhism's no-self, a key difference. One of the most profound contrasts between Jungian psychology and Buddhist philosophy is their perspective on the self. Buddhism teaches Anatta, no-self, that the idea of a permanent, unchanging self is an illusion. Liberation comes from dissolving attachment to identity and realizing that what we call self is just a collection of ever-changing experiences. Jung, in contrast, saw the self not as an illusion but as a vital and real force, a psychological guiding principle that integrates all parts of the psyche into a cohesive whole. While Buddhism seeks to transcend the self, Jung believed that a person must fully develop their self before they can transcend it. He viewed the process of individuation as a necessary step toward inner peace, whereas Buddhism taught that clinging to self-identity was the root of suffering. Jung's later reflections. Bridging the gap. Despite this difference, Jung's later writings showed a growing appreciation for Buddhism's understanding of self-transcendence. He acknowledged that, at the highest levels of psychological development, a person might experience a dissolution of ego similar to Buddhist enlightenment. In his foreword to D.T. Suzuki's work on Zen Buddhism, Jung wrote that the Buddhist doctrine of no-self was one of the most radical propositions in human thought. He recognized that Buddhism approached the human psyche from a perspective beyond individual identity, something that Western psychology had yet to fully embrace. Jung's personal experiences also reflected this shift. His own psychological crisis, documented in the Red Book, led him to states of consciousness that closely resembled Buddhist descriptions of ego dissolution. He described moments where his usual sense of self completely dissolved, revealing what he called the pleroma, a state beyond personal identity, where all dualities merge into one. Conclusion: two paths toward the same goal? At first glance, Jung's self and the Buddhist no-self appear to be opposites, one emphasizing integration, the other dissolution. However, when examined more closely, they reveal two different approaches to the same fundamental truth. Jung's psychology helps individuals understand, integrate, and heal their unconscious mind before moving beyond it. Buddhism encourages practitioners to detach from identity altogether, realizing that suffering arises from attachment to self. Ultimately, both perspectives seek to free individuals from suffering and inner conflict, whether through self-actualization or self-transcendence. The meeting of these two great traditions, Western psychology and Eastern philosophy, offers a deeper, more holistic way of understanding human consciousness and personal transformation. The unexpected convergence between Jung and Buddhism. At first glance, the psychological theories of Carl Jung and the Buddhist doctrine of no-self, Anatta, seem to be in direct opposition. Jung dedicated his life to studying the integration of the self, believing that true psychological healing comes from embracing and unifying all aspects of the psyche. In contrast, the Buddha taught that liberation comes from realizing that the self is an illusion, and that clinging to this illusion is the root cause of suffering. Yet, despite their differences in language and approach, These two profound traditions share a surprising number of parallels in their understanding of human consciousness. A shared insight despite different languages. Jung's depth psychology speaks of the unconscious mind, individuation, and archetypes, while the Buddhist teachings emphasize impermanence, anicca, suffering, dukkha, and no-self, anatta. Though they use different frameworks, both traditions come to the same fundamental realization, that clinging to a rigid sense of self is the primary source of suffering. Jung's patients often struggled with unresolved conflicts between their conscious self and the repressed aspects of their psyche, leading to emotional distress. Through the process of individuation, they gradually integrated these hidden parts, leading to a more complete, authentic self. Buddhist practitioners, through meditation and deep inquiry, observed that the self is not a fixed entity but a constantly changing process. By letting go of attachment to identity, they dissolved suffering at its root. Both Jung and the Buddha recognized that suffering arises when we mistakenly believe in a static, unchanging self. The difference lies in how they approach the solution. Jung aimed for integration while Buddhism taught detachment. The paradoxical similarities. Jung's process of individuation, which involves integrating the unconscious aspects of the psyche, ultimately leads individuals beyond attachment to ego. Though Jung did not advocate for the dissolution of self in the same way Buddhism does, he recognized that one must first become whole before they can transcend the limitations of identity. This is where an unexpected convergence emerges. In Jungian psychology, the goal of individuation is to integrate all aspects of the psyche into a unified self. However, Jung observed that once individuals achieved this integration, they often experienced a shift beyond personal identity, encountering what he called the self with a capital S, a universal, transcendent state of consciousness. In Buddhism, the goal is not to strengthen the self but to see through its illusion. However, Buddhist practitioners also describe reaching a state of profound wholeness and freedom when they let go of the false notion of self. Both traditions describe the ultimate realization as a state that goes beyond duality, where self and no-self dissolve into a greater totality. Whether through deep psychological work or spiritual meditation, the path leads to the same truth. Freedom from suffering comes from releasing attachment to ego. Jung's later reflections, a growing recognition of Buddhist wisdom. In his later years, Jung became increasingly open to the wisdom of Eastern thought, particularly Buddhism's radical teaching on no-self. He recognized that, at its core, Buddhism was not merely a religious doctrine but a profound psychological system that offered deep insights into the workings of the human mind. In his foreword to D.T. Suzuki's writings on Zen, Jung praised the psychological depth of Buddhist teachings, noting that they contained insights Western psychology had only begun to explore. He acknowledged that the Buddhist path leads to a similar transformation to the individuation process, where an individual moves beyond the limitations of ego-based identity and into a state of profound inner clarity. Jung also observed that, in therapy, patients who fully confronted and integrated their unconscious material often reported experiences similar to Buddhist enlightenment. These patients no longer identified with their personal struggles in the same way, but instead saw themselves as part of a larger, interconnected reality. In his personal writings, Jung noted that true self-realization involves dissolving rigid ego structures, leading to a greater sense of freedom and understanding, an insight remarkably similar to Buddhist liberation. Conclusion: two paths toward the same truth? While Jung's integrated self and the Buddhist no-self seem contradictory, they ultimately point toward the same realization. Jung's work teaches that we must first develop a strong sense of self before we can transcend its limitations. Buddhism teaches that the self is an illusion, and that realizing this leads to liberation. Yet, in both traditions, the end result is the same: a state of profound peace, freedom, and detachment from suffering. Jung and the Buddha approached the human psyche from different directions, but their wisdom complements rather than contradicts. Whether one follows the path of integration or transcendence, the ultimate goal remains unchanged: to move beyond the constraints of ego and awaken to a greater reality. Practical applications of these teachings. Understanding the profound insights of Carl Jung's psychology and Buddhist philosophy is valuable, but their real power lies in how we apply them to everyday life. While Jung's work focuses on integrating the unconscious mind, Buddhism teaches detachment from the illusion of self. Surprisingly, these two perspectives can be combined in practical ways to help us heal emotional wounds, cultivate mindfulness, and achieve inner peace. Shadow work and self-inquiry. Embracing the unconscious. Both Jungian psychology and Buddhism emphasize self-exploration, but they approach it differently. Jungian approach. Jung believed that true psychological healing requires us to embrace the unconscious rather than suppress it. This means confronting our shadow, the hidden or rejected aspects of our personality. By acknowledging and integrating these parts, we become more authentic and whole. Buddhist approach. Buddhism, on the other hand, teaches detachment from thoughts and emotions. Instead of engaging with the unconscious directly, it encourages us to observe our thoughts without attachment, recognizing their impermanent nature. By seeing that thoughts arise and pass away on their own, we free ourselves from their control. How to apply this in daily life? Practice self-reflection. Ask yourself, what emotions or thoughts am I suppressing? Use mindfulness meditation to observe thoughts without judgment. Keep a journal to explore recurring patterns in your emotions and behavior. By combining these two approaches, we can understand our unconscious patterns while also learning to let go of identity-based suffering. Mindfulness and active imagination. A path to deeper awareness. Both Jung and Buddhism emphasize the power of awareness, but they use different techniques to access deeper layers of consciousness. Jungian active imagination. Jung developed a technique where patients would interact with their unconscious mind through visualization. For example, someone struggling with fear might imagine speaking to that fear as if it were a person, allowing them to uncover hidden insights. Buddhist meditation. Buddhist mindfulness teaches us to observe the mind without interference, creating space for clarity and insight to naturally arise. By watching thoughts without engaging in them, we dissolve attachment to self-identity. How to apply this in daily life? If you feel stuck emotionally, try visualization exercises to communicate with your inner self. Practice mindfulness meditation to cultivate a state of detached awareness. When faced with stress, observe your emotions as passing phenomena, rather than getting lost in them. This combination helps us process deep emotions while also reducing our attachment to them, leading to greater mental freedom. Healing through detachment, letting go of identity-based suffering. Both Jung and Buddhism ultimately point to freedom through self-awareness and detachment. While Jung teaches us to integrate all aspects of the psyche, Buddhism goes further by helping us see through the illusion of self entirely. Practical applications. Letting go of perfectionism. Many people suffer from the need to be perfect. Jungian psychology teaches that perfection is an illusion of the ego, while Buddhism reminds us that nothing is permanent, including our flaws. Overcoming fear of failure. Jung believed failure is part of individuation, while Buddhism teaches that failure is simply an experience, not a reflection of a fixed self. Releasing self-judgment. By understanding that our self-image is a construct, we stop being so critical of ourselves and others. Ultimately, integrating these teachings allows us to live with greater freedom, clarity, and compassion. By exploring our unconscious while also recognizing the impermanence of self, we step into a state of deeper peace and self-acceptance. At the heart of both Jungian psychology and Buddhist philosophy lies a profound truth. Letting go is not rejection, it is liberation. While Carl Jung explored the self as a process of integration and individuation, the Buddha taught the dissolution of self as the key to freedom from suffering. Though their methods appear different, both paths ultimately lead to the same realization. Peace comes when we stop clinging to a fixed identity. When we loosen our grip on who we think we are, our past, our expectations, our rigid self-concepts, we allow ourselves to grow, adapt, and experience life more fully. Just like the lotus flower rises from the mud, we are not meant to cling to suffering, but to rise beyond it. This journey of self-discovery, whether through inner integration or transcendence of self, offers us the chance to live with greater clarity, freedom, and compassion. If you found value in this discussion, consider subscribing, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and joining this ongoing exploration into the depths of consciousness, psychology, and spiritual wisdom. Let's continue this journey together.